in week 4 of our series, this is the halfway point. Week 4 of our series, Red Letter Living the Words of Jesus Christ. And we've talked about this series that people can believe they believe something that they may not actually believe. And that's so true. In fact, this is one of those holidays, the 4th of July. I'm sad to say in our country today, we celebrate something that we may not actually believe that we want everybody to have, independence, right? And that's where we've gone in this country today, and I don't want to be a downer on it, but that's one of the ideas, independence, that we're really not free in a lot of areas. But we still have more freedom than most do, and so we still thank God that he gave us this ability to be free. But, we've talked about things like, we believe that we should all exercise and eat right and all that, except for most of us, we can believe it, but we don't actually believe it because we don't practice it. Say with savings and things like that. And those are all issues that, we don't want to talk about. Because what we know is that a belief, even though it could be sincere, you can be the most sincere person out there, but if it's not based in reality, a belief that's not based in reality is a delusion. And there are a lot of deluded people in society today that believe things that are not rooted in reality. And that's the whole idea. And when we get down to it, what we said was that following Jesus, ultimately following Jesus, is what happens when our lives align with what we say we believe about him. That's the basic nutshell premise of what we've been talking about in this series. And we're taking the words of Jesus, what Jesus actually taught, what he wanted us to understand, and we're helping ourselves see that Jesus gave us some truths that are actually pretty hard truths. If you remember back in week 1, we talked about living life on mission. And what Jesus expects us to do is take what he has done on the cross and tell everybody about that. And yet we say we believe that, but we don't always do that. And we use our own fears, our own lives to sort of limit ourselves. And then week 2, we talked about living like Jesus, and Jesus gave us the whole idea of we're supposed to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, and mind, and then love others just like we love ourselves. And that's sort of going to flow into a little bit of today's, but that's a tough thing too. And then last week we talked about living as a follower, and that's so hard because Jesus told us if we're going to be a follower, it's not about fun and games. It's not even about coming and doing our time. It's about denying ourselves and daily taking up our cross and following him. And those are things that really, when you get into it, they aren't really easy to do. Today we're going to talk about something that is sort of the opposite of Independence Day celebration, to be honest with you. Today we're going to talk about attitudes. In fact, if I were going to title today, I'd talk about attitude and action. And that's Jesus really did deal with this because it's so important. And I'll explain why it's sort of the opposite of the Independence Day, because and that's the American dream. I don't have to listen to anybody. I want to do my own thing. I want to be independent. And that's sort of how we've gotten to the state we're in today. But Jesus really had a lot to say, and really his life. In fact, I was thinking about this as I was going through it, and the starting place we're going to be in, we're always going to end up in Matthew, because that's the red letter words that we're going to look at. But today we're going to start off in John chapter 2. And in John chapter 2, it is the first miracle of Jesus. And I want to start off by just highlighting, we're going to look at the entire passage pretty much, but I'm going to look at it piecemeal at a time just to point out something here. Maybe look at it differently than you've looked at it before. But in John chapter 2, verse 5, the backdrop of this is Jesus has been invited not to church, but to a wedding. Now, we always assume the wedding was in a church, but not necessarily in first century Palestine. So he has been invited, his disciples have been invited, and his mom is there. And so Jesus now is 30 years old. He's beginning his ministry. The disciples are brand new. They are not sure what they've gotten into. Nothing really has happened, and Jesus hasn't done a miracle yet. And so this is a setting, and we read verse 5. It says in verse number 5, his mother, that is Jesus' mother, said to the servants, people that Jesus didn't even know, Mary didn't really know, they were just servants that worked at this place, said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. And there it is. That's the opposite of Independence Day, isn't it? Follow instructions. Follow orders. Obey. That's not very independent, is it? Because after all, isn't independence not obeying? Isn't that why we separated from good old England? King George was making us obey his rules and not giving us a chance to say or what we want to say, so we didn't want to hear it. So we said, let's separate. And now we come to this verse, and Mary gives us this whole, and that's not Jesus' words, that's Mary's words. She looks at the servants at this wedding and says, hey, do whatever he tells you, that is, Jesus tells you to. I mean, that's sort of crazy, but it really reminded me a lot of how life is for us, because that's really a theme throughout God's word. Jesus has expected us to obey his commands, and yet we don't always like to do that. But I want to see something here in just this short passage here in the first 11, 12 verses of John chapter 2. I want to point out some things about this that helps us form the basis for what we're talking about this morning. This whatever Jesus says to you, you should do it. Let me give you a couple of thoughts about it. Whatever Jesus says to you, do it, even though, number one, I'd tell you this, even though you're not in the right place. What do you mean, not in the right place? Well, see, for a miracle to happen in your life, like Jesus is getting ready to perform, wouldn't we expect it to be in the temple, in the synagogue, in a church, in some kind of religious setting? And you say, well, it is a wedding. Okay, so a Jewish wedding happened a week long. It happened actually 8 days. They started and ended on a same day. But a wedding ceremony would take place, and the ceremony part was already done by the time they got there. So this wedding feast is a party, okay? They partied like it was 1999. I don't know where that expression came from, but that's the expression. So they partied like it's 1999. They partied for a whole week. They did this whole thing, and you're sitting back going, is this really the setting for Jesus to work? I think sometimes we miss out the opportunities that God has for us because we don't think it's the right place. It's not the place that this should happen in. And I think when we get down to it, we should obey Jesus. We should do whatever Jesus tells us to do, even though you're not in the right place. In verse number 1 and 2, let me go ahead and give us our background here. It says, on the third day. By the way, that's an interesting thing. Third day, if you go through the Bible, you're going to find a lot of God works in a lot of third day situations. But nonetheless, John's just pointing out a time period here. We're not preaching a message on the third day. But on the third day, a wedding took place at Cana of Galilee. Cana of Galilee is only mentioned 3 times in the Bible. It is an insignificant village. There's nothing significant about it. It really is nothing. In fact, Galilee, if you haven't caught on from all the sermons I've talked about, Galilee was a pretty insignificant place. Nazareth was about 6 to 8 miles away from Cana, so you're talking a little bit of travel in here, but Jesus was familiar there. And it says that Jesus' mother was there, and that's sort of important. She was there, indicating that she probably knew the people. So we're talking, even though the Bible doesn't tell us, the people in the wedding, the bride and groom, they were either somewhat of a relative or a very close friend for her to be there. It also says in verse number 2 that Jesus and his disciples had been invited. And those disciples, most of them came from Galilee. But Jesus and his disciples also knew the groom to be invited. And so here they are. This is the setting. But that's not the setting we would think. Like Jesus is going to perform a world-changing, God-glorifying miracle at a wedding. Nothing wrong with a wedding, but that wouldn't be the place where you'd think the most. Wouldn't you think down at the hospital? Would you think down at the soup kitchen? Down where the lepers are, where all the people needed the miracle? Weddings are usually pretty happy, I guess. Or at least for some of the people, weddings are happy. And some of you guys aren't happy right now, but okay, I'm trying here. Okay, the second thing we realize here is whatever Jesus tells you to do it even though you have a lot of problems. And that seems to be the issue here. See, the backdrop, we've told you where it happened. Now we talk about what's going on. In verse number 3, it goes on to say this, that when the wine was gone, that's important, Jesus' mother, that is Mary, said to him, they have no more wine. Okay, I'm not going to even address the whole alcoholic or non-alcoholic. That's not in the story today, so we're not worried about that. You can come back at a later time. We'll talk about it some other day. But what I want you to see, the situation was important. They had no wine. They had no more wine. You say, well, what's the big deal? Let them drink some soda. Let them have some water. Could they find something else to drink? This is where our understanding as Americans sort of limits us. See, this was shocking to me when I read through this. Did you realize that if you're invited to a wedding and the wedding party ran out of wine or food, they could actually file legal charges against you as the bride or groom, and you could be forced to either pay them money or take them away to jail, prison. So, as you've read this verse 100 times before and thought, what's the big deal not having wine? They probably didn't need to get drunk anyway, as good old Baptists were saying that. the situation was a little bit more dire than what we understand. See, the situation was when Jesus' mother comes and intervenes, she comes up and she says, you know what? Jesus, they don't have any wine. This could get ugly. The governor of the feast, the person who's in charge, he was in charge because he was there to make sure everybody's rights were represented equally. He was there to make sure everybody got what they were deserving because, after all, they were expected to bring a gift, so the bride and groom were expected to have food and drink for the entire time. And so when Jesus is confronted with this problem, it seems like, oh man, there's a big time problem. And that's one of those hard times in our lives. See, it's hard sometimes to obey, to follow instructions, to do what Jesus says when we have problems, isn't it? I think too many of us, we focus so hard on our problems in life that we don't go to the person who can solve the problems. And Mary here understood that issue. She understood because she's talking to Jesus. Whatever Jesus says to do it, even though the third thing is that you are not encouraged. Okay, go to the next verse, verse number 4. You're not encouraged. Well, this is how Jesus responds to his mom. Woman, by the way, it's going to sound to us as like he's being disrespectful. How can the Son of God be disrespectful? The term woman, it was actually the correct term, and it was nothing that would be considered dishonorable to women. So when he says woman, he's not saying, woman! He's not saying it like you thinking he's saying it. He's saying woman very politely. It was a little odd that he's saying it to his mom because it really doesn't identify as him being her being the mom. It's just a woman. Why do you involve me? And that's a common phrase that they would have used in Hebrew. It really means, hey, listen, why do you involve me? It's either somebody is getting nasty, and in this case we know Jesus isn't doing that, or he's saying, hey, it's none of my business. Don't involve me in something that's none of my business. And that's what he's saying. Why would you involve me? And then he says, my hour has not yet come. And if you're Mary, like, I don't know, the question here in verse number 4, we have to ask ourselves, what was Mary expecting? Now, maybe you're sitting back going, well, she was thinking a miracle. Was she really? Because Jesus hadn't done it yet. 30 years of his life, no miracles. How do I know that? Because it says so in the story. This is the first of his miracles. He hasn't done that. So why would she expect him to do something now? It was a dire thing, and for some reason she turned to him, and he replies with something that's not encouraging. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have this attitude sometimes with God is, hey, you know what? The words of Jesus aren't always encouraging, are they? We've gone through 3 weeks of pretty hard things that we've said, that Jesus said, that we're supposed to do. And you know what? I don't sometimes want to go, hey, let's meet. Today's the day I really want to get crucified. Today's the day I really want to give up my rights. Today's the day I want to live for not me, but for Jesus. Because it's not always fun. You're not always encouraged. It is sometimes that Jesus invites us into the fellowship of his sufferings, not into the fellowship of his enjoyment. If you didn't read that in the Bible, it does say that. I mean, think about Paul. When Paul has become a Christian, the first guy that's going to see Paul, he's told to go tell Paul, hey, tell this guy, Saul is his name at the time, tell Saul all the things that he gets to suffer for my name's sake. Is that something you want to tell somebody, especially somebody you don't know? Hey, Paul, here's what you get for being that guy that just accepted Jesus Christ. You get suffering for the rest of your life. Eventually, it's going to lead to you being decapitated. That's great, isn't it? It's not very encouraging, though. And sometimes when we obey Jesus, it's not encouraging. I don't want you to think it's all, hey, it's not all ponies and flowers. You know that, right? It's not all a bed of roses. Sometimes it's hard things. And of course, I think here, when you get down to it, we have to obey Jesus. We have to follow Jesus, even though it's not encouraging. Whatever Jesus says to you, do it, even though the next one, you have not walked with Jesus very long. Here's what we're talking about. Jesus just met these guys. These servants didn't know him at all, and he's starting to give them orders. He starts barking out orders. In fact, it goes on there in verse number 5. It says, his mother said to him, and we read this, said to the servants, do whatever he tells you to do. Man, I don't want some other guy coming in and telling me, I don't work for you. Isn't that how we take it? Some guy walks up. Have you ever been doing something, somebody walks up and starts giving you directions, and you're like, who are you? Who are you? You're not the boss of me. I don't have to listen to you. You may be right, but I don't want to listen to you. I would think that would be probably more like the servants, although they did their job. But that's what it is. See, they hadn't walked with Jesus very long, and yet Jesus is starting to give them orders. These servants who obey Jesus had just met Jesus. Think about this too. The disciples who were there watching Jesus, they had just started following him. Most of them were following John the Baptist. They just got hooked up with Jesus, and all of a sudden, he's barking out orders here and there, and he's talking to his mom like, leave me alone. And you're sitting there thinking, did I make the wrong choice? And I think sometimes we get in our lives like this, and we don't always obey Jesus because, well, we haven't grown. We haven't followed Jesus very long. And I'm not talking about time. I know people who've been saved for 50 years, and they don't seem like they've grown more than a year's worth of growth in their Christian life. It's not about time. It's about walking with Jesus and honestly learning to serve at his feet. And that's the truth. Do whatever he tells you. And they did. That's what's amazing. Whatever Jesus tells you to do it even though the next one, you have not seen him work miracles in your life. This is what I told you before. If you skip all the way down, we're going to go to the end now. In verse number 11 of our passage, it says, what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee, so you know this is it. This is the monument they're putting there. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs. That word signs, it actually could translate miracles or signs. Either way, it's interchangeable. The first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. It's that point where things change for him. See, what's crazy about obeying Jesus is that sometimes you may never have seen him do a miracle in your life. Sometimes you've heard other people talk about it. Doesn't it bother you sometimes? When I was in Bible college, I was a poor Bible college student. You can say, oh, yeah, thanks. That's about all I got out of that, too. A highlight of our day, every day, was a certain time you knew the mail would be put out for the day. And we had these little boxes you had to go check. And I'm serious. It was sad. I remember even dates with my wife. We went to the BK Lounge. That's Burger King. And I would scrounge up enough change to buy a large fry and probably a drink that we would split. And that was our meal on date night. So there you can say, oh, again. Okay. Yeah, I was suffering for Jesus, you can tell. What bothered me, though, because every time, and I know this is sort of weird, but I was always expecting, because I heard all these stories about all these guys getting money sent to them by people they didn't even know, heard preachers say it all the time. So I'm sitting there like, okay, Jesus, I got tuition bill coming up. I got to pay this thing. I've been working. There was one semester I worked 3 jobs. I slept less than 2 hours a day, and it's just, you can say, oh, again. Okay, thanks. You're making me feel good, really. I'm just saying, I would go like say this little prayer. Okay, Jesus, I really could use a check from somebody I don't know. Please, 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 Lord, come on, you can do it. And in the meanwhile, and they had these goofy old, it was a combination type thing you had to know, and they were so hard. And you opened it up, and what I get? Junk mail. Sometimes bills. And I'm like, oh, I don't need this. Or yet, even worse, it was a note that said, come see the financial aid office because you owe money. And I'm like, oh, man. Meanwhile, there was a guy next to me. His name was Doug. Doug was a good guy. I was the RA. He was one of my guys on my floor. Doug would come in, and he'd open up his thing. His dad had already paid his school bill. He didn't need any money. He opens up his, and he's like, praise Jesus, I got a check for $500 from somebody I don't even know. And I'm like, oh, I hate you. I just have to be honest. And there were so many of these guys, and you know what always followed is we had our chapel service, our daily chapel service, and we go into chapel, and they do this like, hey, anybody got anything to praise God about? And I'm sitting there going, nope. I'm going to go see the financial aid office. And yet the rest of the guys are all going, praise Jesus, I just got a check from $500. I got a check for $1,000. I'm like, who are these guys, and where do they get these people to find them? I mean, this is an internet day. This is way before internet, and I'm just saying, God doesn't work in miracles in my life, and sometimes it was hard to obey him. And I'm trying to make a little humor out of what was really going on, but sometimes you may have found that to be true. Hey, you're in the hospital. Hey, you lost a loved one. Somebody died. Somebody's sick. You lost a job. You have car problems. You have all these things mounting. Your air conditioner goes out in this kind of nice weather. And you can't fix it. You can't change it. And you're going, God, why are you doing this to me? And you start questioning what he tells us to do because you're not sure, because you've never seen any of the miracles. That's how these guys were. They had never seen any miracles. This is the very first one. Mary didn't know. The disciples didn't know. And those servants sure didn't know. Nobody did. Let me give you one more. Whatever Jesus says to you, do it, even though you don't understand the entire process. I think that's so important here as we get into this, because these servants, first of all, no one knew what a miracle was because no one was doing miracles. Jesus wasn't doing any. And so Jesus, it says here, and we'll read a couple verses now, verses 6 through 8. It says here, verses 6 through 8, nearby, that is, Jesus tells them to do this. So nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing. So he's just explaining what they were so you get a good picture. And we're not Jewish, so you don't have a good picture, but they're big. Verse 7, it says, in verse 6, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. So 6 times 20 or 6 times 30. So we're talking between 120 to 150 gallons of water. That's a little bit of water, right? And they didn't have indoor plumbing. It wasn't get the garden hose and hook it up and let's do this thing, right? Think about this. So verse number 7 says, Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars, and they're sitting there going, you go fill them, joker. I ain't filling 120 to 150 gallons. That's not really in the Bible. But that's what they were thinking, wasn't it? Because that's what you probably would be thinking if somebody come along to you and there's no garden hose, there's no running water. You have to go to where the closest well is and get 120 gallons of water. Now think about a full 5-gallon bucket carrying that around. They got 6 of these. 6 that holds between 20 to 30 gallons. That's a lot of water. That's a lot of work. And that's unusual work for people who are usually serving to have to go out and stop everything and go get water. Fill water. And I was waiting for one of them to go in the story, go, hey, wait a minute. We don't need water. We need wine. Did you not understand that? But they didn't question him, even when it was strange. And we do that sometimes. When God says, hey, you need to give to someone who is in need and you don't really have any money to give, isn't that strange sometimes? But that's what God wants. It says, fill the jars with water, so they filled them. And I love the fact that John put this in. So they filled them halfway, right? Filled them to the brim, all the way up. Verse 8, then he told them, there's more. Now draw out some and take it to the master of the banquet, the guy who's in charge, and they did so. And I think that's the hardest part sometimes about obeying Jesus. Sometimes when we're followers of Jesus, we don't understand the process in our life. I don't understand why Johnny has had COVID and it's knocked him down for so long. I really don't. I don't have the answers, and I'm sure Johnny would say the same thing, but there are reasons why God did what he did. That's the truth. And I don't know in this story, I don't know exactly at what point did the water become wine. It doesn't tell us. All it goes on to tell us, and you can read through the whole story because we're not going to read through all the extra verses, but what we find out here is that the water becomes wine. I don't know if it's when it hits the lips of the guy who's drinking and then he says something. I don't know if it's when they start pulling it out. But now they're believing this guy, and they see some things that are crazy, and they're the only guys who know that there's crazy going on. But it was strange, the request, fill these ceremonial cleansing pots with water, a lot of it. And now they've got 120 to 150 gallons of wine to give out, and it becomes the best. And that's how they respond. And what this story teaches us, and this is the importance of it, you say, what's this got to do with attitude? What this story teaches us is that obedience, by definition, according to this story, obedience is listening to the words of Jesus, and that's where we want to stop, because we're all good with listening to words. And doing his will is the rest of it. Listening to the words of Jesus and doing his will. So if you didn't take the words of Jesus from week 1 of this series and go out and start talking to people about the gospel message, Matthew 28, then you're only doing half of what we call obedience, and so half obedience is not really obedience at all. If you're not loving the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and you're not loving your fellow neighbor as yourself, according to week 2 of this series, then you're just listening to words and you're not doing the will. so you're not really obeying. If you're not following, that is, you're not daily taking up your cross and denying yourself and following Jesus daily, then you're just listening to words and you're not doing his will, because that's what we learn. And obedience, really, what we know about obedience is inward obedience provides outward growth, and that's how we do that. And what that changes is the fact that obedience leads us to attitude. And here's our definition for attitude. Attitude is an inward feeling expressed by behavior. It's action. See, remember I told you this at the beginning of the series. Jesus didn't call anybody just to believe. He called them to follow. In fact, one of the words in our story here in John chapter 2, verse 11, it says at that time the disciples believed. It actually doesn't really translate to be believe. It translates, they put their full trust and confidence and faith in him. That would be the more precise way to do it. They put action to how they were thinking of him. It wasn't just a belief. It was something that was an inward feeling that expressed behavior. And the problem, and the real idea behind this is our attitude is the primary force that will determine whether we succeed or fail in life. It really is. Our attitude is such an important thing. In fact, I came up with a couple things I wanted you to understand here. Our attitude determines our approach in life, doesn't it? You ever heard the story of the old man, the old grandfather, who laid down and took a nap on a sofa one day, and his grandkids were all full of foolishness, and so they came up to him and they thought they'd play a little joke on him. So they went into the kitchen and they found some Limburger cheese. Stinky cheese, man, stinky cheese. And they brought it into him and they rubbed it all over his mustache, into his beard, and he didn't know. Well, after a little while sleeping, it sort of woke him up, the smell. It was just so gross. And so he sat up, and as they watched him, he sat up and he looked around and took a deep breath and he said, "It stinks in here." So he got up and walked into the kitchen, took a deep breath in the kitchen, and he said, "Oh my goodness, it stinks in here too. I think I'll go out and get some fresh air." So he opened up the door, walked outside, took a huge breath of air, said, "It stinks here. The whole world stinks." And that's sometimes how we determine our lives, isn't it? Because our attitude determines our approach to life. It wasn't really that the world stinks. It was that he had something on him that stunk. I think about Paul. Paul had a right approach to life. Philippians 4:4, and I didn't put this verse up here, but in Philippians 4:4 it says, "Rejoice in the Lord always," and again I say rejoice. He wrote that from a prison cell as they're getting ready to behead him. How do you have that kind of, if I'm in that prison cell, probably if you're in that prison cell, we're like, oh me. We'd have Eeyore next to us. You guys Winnie the Pooh fans? Okay, Eeyore with his little cloud over him. He'd say, "Oh me, looks like it's going to rain." That's what we'd be doing. We'd be crying. We'd be telling everybody how bad life is. Not Paul. Paul already knew. See, Paul got it on day one. He was invited to the fellowship of sufferings. He was told that he's going to have to suffer a lot of things for Jesus, and so he knew. So that's why he could sit back and say, hey, my attitude should reflect my obedience. And that's how it is. It's the inward feeling expressed by behavior. Our attitude determines our approach to life. Our attitude can turn our problems, too, into blessings. Isn't that true? It was true for a guy named Joseph. He went through the pit, through the dungeon, and he found himself on the throne. That's what's great about him. Moses, here's another guy. Moses spent 40 years talking to sheep on the backside of a desert before he began to be the leader that we know him to be in the Bible. He was 80 before he started his ministry. 80 years old. 80 years old. Just amazing. And what did it do? Hey, our attitude can turn our problems into blessings. That's the truth. How about this one? Our attitude can give us an uncommonly positive perspective. David, a little teenage boy, the Bible says ruddy in complexion, little redheaded boy, right? He goes to check on his brothers and sees this 9.5-foot tall giant named Goliath out there cursing God and blaspheming, and he gets upset and he says, I'll do it. I don't know what the rest of you guys are sitting around for, but I'll do it. And the Bible, my favorite part about the whole story is that he runs to the battle. He runs to the battle. He didn't dread it. Yeah, he didn't have armor. He didn't even have a sword. He took a couple of stones with him and a sling and God's presence, and that's really the whole idea there. because his attitude was formed by obedience to God. And our attitude is an inward feeling expressed by behavior. And his behavior said, you know what? It's going to cause me an uncommonly positive perspective because I have the attitude that God's in charge. One more. Our attitude is not automatically good just because we're Christ followers. That's so true. I think about in Jesus' story of the prodigal son. We know about the sinful prodigal son, but how about the older brother? He represents us, the Christ followers who are sitting around. And he had the same rotten attitude towards the father as the young prodigal son. Just as bad. Even though his father had extended him grace, he trampled on it. Jonah. Jonah, he's another good story about a guy who had bad attitude, even though he was a God-fearing Christ follower, you could say. What was Jonah's problem? He didn't want God to save Nineveh. So first attempt was, I'm not going to preach there, which God redirected him. That's the famous part of the story. But what happens is he goes and ends up getting pushed by God to do what God wanted him to do. Nineveh repents from the king all the way down to the lowest person is what the Bible says. They put on sackcloth, they throw ash on their face and head, and there's a revival in Nineveh, except for one Jewish guy who sits down and curses everything around him. He gets mad about God. God, I wanted you to punish these people. And we were talking about this earlier today. There are some people out there that just misrepresent Christianity because they want God to do all kinds of pain and inflict all kinds of problems on people. And that's not what God came to do. Jesus came to seek and to save that which was lost. He died for sinners, of which Paul would say, I'm the worst. I'm the chiefest. And that's the whole idea. Do you see the difference in attitude? Attitude is such a problem. Well, let's go to our main passage over in Matthew chapter 7. We always get to Matthew and then the words of Jesus. And these are probably words you associated with prayer, but they really aren't about prayer. They really aren't. They're about attitude. In Matthew, he records in chapters 5, 6, and 7 the Sermon on the Mount. And Matthew here, this one part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus starts talking and he says some things that are just so crazy. In verses 7 and 8, he says, ask. Notice the action verbs here. Ask, and it will be given to you. And most of us say, doubt that. I ask all the time for $1 million. Nobody ever gives me that. I ask for, better house, better wife, better husband, better kids, better, and all the promises, right? Ask, and it'll be given you. Seek, and you will find. See, if we take this as things we have to do for earning prayer things, then we get to this whole, I earned it because I worked for it thing. And that's not it at all. It's attitude here. Ask and it'll be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. And those kind of statements there, he's not talking about earning something. He's talking about have the right attitude. When life is bleak, when life doesn't, when you're getting lemons in life, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to make lemonade, right? That's his way of saying it. He's saying have the proper perspective here. In verse 8, he goes on and tells us why. He says, for everyone. And if you've missed that, you missed the whole thing, because he's not just saying the guy who prays a prayer, the guy who worships me, the guy who's this one thing. He says, no, for everyone who asks, receives. That's great. For everyone who seeks, finds. And to the one who knocks, the door will be open. That's just great, because how many times in life has life let you down because you thought you were doing the right thing and it didn't come up the way you wanted? And what he's saying here is have the right attitude towards God the Father. And really what he wants us to learn in lesson number 1 in these 2 verses is the fact that pursuing the will of God determines the right perspective. See, that's what he's trying to help them understand. Not pursuing personal agendas. God's not going to give you $1 million if you say, I want to win the lottery. Okay, but I won't talk about the lottery today, but we'll talk about it some other day. Just know this, Dave Ramsey says the lottery is a fool's tax. He's right. Pursuing the will of God determines the right perspective. It does. It doesn't mean you're going to get everything you want, but you know what? When I ask and I think I'm going to get, it changes the perspective of what I'm going to do. It's my attitude, isn't it? See, when I pursue the will of God, I'm going to determine the right perspective in life. I'm going to start thinking that God is the creator of everything. He owns it all, and he gives me what he thinks I need, so I don't need more. Well, doesn't it change your attitude a little bit when you start thinking like that? Hey, when I'm laying up in the hospital and I'm upset because I'm ill and I blame it on God, That means I wasn't pursuing God's will and I didn't have the right perspective on it, right? Because God wanted me here for one reason or the other. God is sovereign, and that's what we have to trust in. That God allows things in our life that we may not want, but he says it's all for our good. Because that's what he said in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, to those who are called according to his purpose, those that love him, right? That's what it says. And his glory, by the way. We don't want to leave that out. He goes on, verses 9 through 11, he says, which of you, and I just imagine Jesus talking to this crowd that day, and he starts pointing out, which of you, looking around there, he says, which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone? To which the crowd would have understood, and it's a rhetorical answer, but nobody on this planet is going to do that. Nobody's going to do it. In fact, he keeps going, next verse he says, or if he asks for fish, we'll give him a snake. Are you kidding me? That's so extreme, that's ridiculous. And that's his point. He's saying, which of you, when your child is starving, hungry, needs bread or needs fish, because those are the common foods of the day, we give them a stone or a snake, because snakes aren't good and stones are used to kill snakes. I don't know how to do that. You wouldn't eat a stone. I'm just telling you that. And he goes on, verse 11, he says, if then, here's my point, if then, though you are evil, well, that's tough. He just pointed at all of us and said, if you are evil, and you know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? And notice it didn't end with a question mark. It ended with an exclamation point. Question mark, he wanted you to answer it. Exclamation point, he's saying, listen, it's an attitude adjustment once again. Why? Because when things go wrong in my life, what do? I blame God. If things went wrong in your family, should your kids blame you, parents? That's the point. That's what he's saying. When things go wrong in your family, should the kids blame the parents? No. When things don't go right in your life, should you blame your Father in heaven? No. Why? Because we should have the obedience attitude. The attitude that says, hey, my inward feelings tell me I should trust God and obey whatever he tells me to do. And that brings us to the second example here about attitude and action, where he tells us that your attitude determines your approach in life. It really does. See, when my attitude gets off, I start thinking that God might give me stones. He might put a snake in my path. He might just treat me like that. And that was the whole point, wasn't it? God didn't give you the bad things. God only gives you the good things. If an evil father, an evil mother can do the good things, how much better could an awesome God do? That's the attitude approach we need to have. And when we have that attitude, we don't look at our problems in life and go, poor me. God did this to me. And the reason we blame God is most of the time it's our fault. We put ourselves in those bad situations. You know? Then he goes on, last verse. So in everything. And I think that's so important. So in everything, so in everything, so in everything. You say, well, you didn't bold that one. I know. So in everything, though, is so important because it's all-inclusive, right? In everything. That is, in all of my life. So there's never a time that you don't get to practice this part of what to do here. It says, so in everything, the golden rule. Do to others what you'd have them do to you. Do to others what you would have them do to you. And then he makes sure we understand, for this sums up the law and the prophets. In the Talmud, there's a story about one of the more famous rabbis who was asked by a Gentile, a non-Jew, to sum up as concisely and as few words, sum up the law of God. And this was one of those challenges that they were all trying to face. This is Jesus' interpretation of it, and that's what he's letting you know. But this prophet, this guy named Hillel, Rabbi Hillel, he was one of the more famous ones. He said this. He says, what is hateful for you, do not do to your neighbor. That's the whole law, the whole Torah. Go, he said the rest is all commentary. He says, go and learn it. What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That sounds pretty much the same thing. And that's what Jesus is trying to say. Why do I do hateful things to my neighbor? I do hateful things to my neighbor because of the wrong attitude. I do hateful things to the person driving that car next to me because I get road rage, which is an attitude problem that the preacher has. And you do too. So don't try and act like you don't. Right? My wife and I, we went out of town for a couple days to celebrate our anniversary, and she wanted to stop at this store, this Amish store, which I usually like, except for it was packed. And I like people, I just don't like to be in a tin can type atmosphere where, every time you turn there's somebody in your face. So I was trying to find places to get out of the way. And I just found myself God was saying, hey, you're going to preach about this on Sunday, and you're not going to listen to do it on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday or any of the other days, right? And it's easy to preach, but it's hard to obey, isn't it? Because all those people, there's one particular family with this woman who was just being as rude as possible. I was one of those sons of thunder wanting to call down some fire on some people, you know what I'm saying? Maybe you don't know what I'm saying. But I was thinking things like that. And then I realized, okay, God's testing you to let you know your attitude's wrong because I'm supposed to do what I said in week number 2, right? Love my neighbor as myself. Love the Lord my God with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my mind. Love my neighbor as myself. Didn't know how to practice that. See, what he says here in verse number 12, and this is the third and final example, is that your attitude develops or diminishes your relationships. And that's what he's trying to help us understand. Not just with other people, but with God too. And so as we think about this, our attitude develops or diminishes our relationships. And you say, well, that's no brainer. You would think so, but remember, we can believe it, but we may not really believe it if we don't actually practice it. So why do we keep developing the wrong attitude? And let me give you why. It's a formula for spiritual success, and let me help you here on this one. I didn't put this on screen because I felt like I was giving a lot of information today on screen, but formula for spiritual success. If you want to be distressed in life, just look within yourself. If you want to be defeated in life, look back at your past. If you want to be distracted in life, start looking around. If you want to be dismayed, look ahead at all the obstacles ahead. But if you want to be delivered, you need to look up. That's the success rule. Just look up. That's what Jesus wants us to do. So what's the sum of today? What do we know about red letter living? Red letter living, it guides the attitude and determines your path. Our attitude, as several people have put it clearly, and I didn't want to use the old expression, but your attitude determines your altitude in life. It really does. It guides the attitude. This red letter living, that's what Jesus is trying to help us. When he said ask, seek, knock. When he said treat others the way you'd want yourself to be treated, he's saying your attitude, it guides and determines your path. So the next time you have road rage, think about the last time you cut somebody off the wrong way by accident and how you were like, calm down, right? Because you were guilty and you wanted them to forgive you, but you weren't willing to extend that same grace. The next time you find yourself in a spot where you're blaming God, calm down. Let your feelings go away and change your attitude to an attitude of obedience. Because that's what it basically comes down. The obedience helps us in our attitude. Listening, and not just listening, but doing the will of God is true obedience.